Susan Yockey with VOA's Middle East Monitor. Coming up, criticism for nations that let the Syrian crackdown continue. Is the covert war on Iran heating up?
The covert campaign is something that's been in the making for years now, and we're seeing an intensification of it.
The Egyptian political picture taking form, and 80% of you who took our online poll agree on a certain action. It's all ahead on The Voice of America. In a new report, Human Rights Watch sharply criticizes Russia and China for blocking action on Syria in the UN Security Council and takes aim at other countries that it says have also been obstacles to stopping the 10-month violent repression in Syria. From the United Nations, VOA's Margaret Bashir has more on that story.
The annual human rights review of more than 90 countries highlights the spread of the Arab Spring democratic movement and urges the international community to give strong support to the countries in North Africa and the Middle East that are seeking democratic reform, instead of backing autocrats who have kept oil exports flowing. In its report, the monitoring group Human Rights Watch criticizes some Western governments for being slow in challenging former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak until it was clear he would have to step down. The group also says there has been little real pressure on Bahrain's government for having crushed its democracy movement. And in Yemen, the rights group expressed disappointment that Western countries accepted a plan that includes immunity for outgoing President Ali Abdullah Saleh. Human Rights Watch reserved its strongest criticism for the events in Syria, where the government of President Bashar al-Assad has brutally put down anti-government protests. The rights group says the ongoing repression has undermined the few reforms President Assad has enacted. The report details large-scale military operations on several towns and the arbitrary arrest, torture, and murder of thousands of citizens. Speaking at the United Nations launch of World Report 2012, Human Rights Watch's UN Director, Philippe Boulopion, singled out Russia and China, which used their Security Council veto in October to prevent a resolution on Syria.
We think they really bear a huge responsibility. Over 3,000 people have been killed in Syria since the two countries casted their vetoes to block any council action, and we still haven't had a single resolution on Syria, despite more than 5,000 people having been killed.
Boulopion said Russia's actions are especially disturbing because they can be seen to be contributing to the escalation of violence in Syria. He pointed to recent media reports about a Russian ship carrying ammunition that docked in the Syrian port of Tartus, and another report that Moscow has signed a $500 million deal to sell 36 fighter jets to Damascus.
Russia has presided over really what have been half-hearted attempts at negotiating a weak resolution over the last few weeks. In the meantime, Russia has continued selling and delivering weapons to Syria, which is really an insult to the Syrian people who are at the receiving end of these weapons.
Boulopion also criticized India and South Africa, which are non-permanent members of the UN Security Council, and Brazil, which recently completed a 2-year council term in December, for their positions on Syria. All three abstained on the Syria resolution that Russia and China vetoed in October. Boulopion called that a profound mistake.
For countries, who are emerging power, who are countries who have a pretty decent record on human rights at home, it's extremely disturbing to see that in the Security Council, they have been siding with Russia and China on this.
For months, the Security Council has been divided over what to do on Syria. On Sunday, the Arab League called on the UN's most powerful body to support its initiative to end the violence. The plan calls for President Assad to transfer power to a deputy and allow the formation of a national unity government with the opposition within 2 months. The new government would be responsible for organizing parliamentary and presidential elections under Arab and international supervision. The Syrian government has rejected the plan. Margaret Bashir, VOA News, the United Nations.
Big news coming out of Egypt. Field Marshal Hussein Tantawi has announced a partial lifting of the country's hated emergency laws. The decision to partially lift the decades-old laws, which give police far-reaching powers, will likely not satisfy rights groups that have been campaigning for the total removal of the laws. But it may be a first start. Rights groups say at least 12,000 civilians have been tried before military tribunals since the generals took power nearly a year ago. Tantawi's address came one day after Egypt's first freely elected parliament in decades held its inaugural session, a significant step in the handover process. Egypt's lower house of parliament convened Monday for the first time since democratic elections ushered in a new crop of lawmakers, many of them representing Islamist parties. Noel King, in this report from Cairo, looks at the new House Speaker from the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party.
Following his nomination last week, Mohammed Saad El-Khattatni, who previously served as Secretary General of the Freedom and Justice Party, was voted in as Speaker of Egypt's lower house with 399 votes on Monday. Freedom and Justice, the political wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, captured 47% of the vote in elections for the lower house of parliament. Khattatni, 60, spent much of his working career in the sciences. He was a botanist and taught botanical microbiology at the university level. His political career emerged after joining the Muslim Brotherhood and rose through a variety of party positions in the last decade. He was elected to parliament in 2005 and represented the parliament in numerous international conferences. Khattatni is the first Islamist Speaker of the House in Egypt's history. Khattatni has said his priorities include ensuring that Egypt moves quickly toward a democratic state and ending the interim period that began when ex-President Hosni Mubarak stepped aside 1 year ago. Egypt has been governed by a council of high-ranking military officers. Political sociologist Saeed Sadiq wonders, though, whether Khattatni will be a unifying force in the new parliament.
A weak parliament doesn't enjoy the support of the people. A strong parliament must enjoy the support of the Tahrir, which means that this parliament must carry out the objectives of the revolution.
Sadiq said those demands include reforms for which many Egyptians have waited decades. He says it is the new parliament's job to ensure reform.
It must push for transitional justice, purging the Egyptian government, restructuring the Ministry of Interior, and the security services. They have to have a new philosophy, new ideas, not the same old policy. Fighting corruption. These are the priorities.
Earlier this week, the Liberal Free Egyptians Party criticized Khattatni, charging that he had been nominated without any input from liberal political groups. Egyptian liberals did poorly in the parliamentary elections, which were dominated by the Islamist Freedom and Justice Party and even more conservative Salafi parties. Elections for Egypt's upper house of parliament, which traditionally has held little power, will begin in February. Presidential elections are scheduled for June. Noel King, VOA News, Cairo.
January 25, 2012 marks the one-year anniversary of the Egyptian revolution in Tahrir Square. The protests, which were televised to millions worldwide, were a seminal moment in the Arab Spring youth movement of 2011. We are selecting this date to have a wide-ranging discussion on Facebook live at 1700 UTC on Wednesday, January 25th. Our topic, the Arab Spring 1 year on, better or worse? If you'd like to join us, visit facebook.com/Voice of America. Visit our event page and RSVP. See you on Facebook.
On Saturday, a member of Kuwait's royal family, Sheikh Saud Nasser Al Sabah, died at the age of 68. Sheikh Saud served as Kuwait's ambassador to the U.S. from 1981 to 1992, and upon the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990, became the voice and face of his country to the world during the occupation of Kuwait and the Gulf War that expelled Iraq. VOA's Jeffrey Young knew Sheikh Saud personally and spent years with him in Kuwait during its reconstruction after the war. He joined me a little earlier today. Welcome, Jeff.
Well, good to see you, Susan.
Thank you. What was the relationship between Sheikh Saud and the White House?
Rather extraordinary. Sheikh Saud, while very much a member of the royal family of Kuwait, was very adept at interfacing with the West. He had a law degree from Oxford, and prior to his appointment as ambassador to the United States, he spent years in London. Sheikh Saud developed a substantial relationship with President George H.W. Bush, that's Bush 41, and with then Defense Secretary Dick Cheney and others in Washington. Sheikh Saud's powers of persuasion were key to the construction of the U.S. response to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which became a coalition of many nations, including a number of Kuwait's Arab state neighbors. This coalition between the West and the Arab states was extraordinary for its time, and it would still be extraordinary today.
How did Sheikh Saud change the historic presence of the United States in the Persian Gulf?
While the United States had acted on behalf of Kuwait before, protecting Kuwaiti tankers during the 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq War, there had not been U.S. military bases before in that region. Sheikh Saud and the other members of his government, including the Emir Sheikh Jabbar, felt that having U.S. military ground and air forces in Kuwait was a sound deterrent to any further aggression by Saddam. Those U.S. forces in Kuwait remain to this day, joined in the mid-1990s by the basing of the U.S. Fifth Naval Fleet in Bahrain, which today ensures that the Straits of Hormuz, through which a great deal of the world's oil flows, remains open despite threats by Iran.
After the war, Sheikh Saud returned to Kuwait and became its information minister, responsible for state radio and TV broadcasting and Kuna, the state news agency. What profound changes did he bring to those operations?
Sheikh Saud knew and respected Western journalism and its tenets. He ruffled the established order of things by conducting Western-style free-for-all news conferences where reporters could ask nearly anything and he would respond. For that part of the world, this was extraordinary, Susan. The news broadcasting in Kuwait was reoriented to provide real coverage of world events, not just the comings and goings at the Emiri Diwan, the Emir's house, which is the norm in Gulf countries. Today, the Emir made a phone call to King such and such, okay? Sheikh Saud's forwardness in news and communications arguably led to a wider opening among the Gulf countries that eventually created essentially independent news operations such as Al Jazeera and others. For that part of the world, this was a huge sea change.
Well, thank you so much for your insight, Jeff.
We have lost an extraordinary person in Sheikh Saud. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Jeff. That's VOA reporter Jeffrey Young here in our Washington studios. You're tuned to Middle East Monitor, broadcasting to you from Washington. Stay tuned at the bottom of the hour Universal Time for world news on International Edition. Western pressure on Iran over its nuclear program continues to mount. The European Union agreed Monday to impose an embargo on Iranian oil and freeze assets of the central bank. And as VOA senior correspondent Gary Thomas reports, Iran is feeling pressure from a heightened campaign of covert action.
A string of killings of people associated with Iran's nuclear program, a series of unexplained explosions at Iranian military facilities, and introduction of a deadly computer virus are signs, analysts say, that the campaign of covert warfare against Iran has been ratcheted up. In the most recent case, Iranian nuclear scientist Mostafa Ahmadi Roshan was killed January 11th by a magnetic bomb attached to his car. Reid Fabala, Middle East analyst with the private intelligence firm Stratfor, says policymakers turn to covert action as a course between diplomacy and warfare.
That's when policymakers turn to this gray area of covert operations as a means to deal with the situation when you lack better options. And so the covert campaign is something that's been in the making for years now, and we're seeing an intensification of it precisely because all of the United States and its allies are increasingly concerned with Iran's rise and are looking for ways to limit it.
3 other Iranian nuclear scientists have been killed over the past 2 years. No one has publicly claimed responsibility for their deaths. But Iran has blamed the intelligence agencies of the United States, Britain, and Israel. The United States categorically denied any involvement, and Britain did not comment. Israeli officials denied knowing who was involved in the killing, but one Israeli spokesman said he was not, as he put it, shedding tears over it. Covert action is intended to influence events with a hidden hand. Usually carried out by a nation's intelligence agencies, operations can range from trying to swing a foreign election to sabotage an assassination. But such operations are risky because of the possibility of public exposure. Will Toby, a senior fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, says whoever is carrying out the killings is willing to take the risk.
Well, I would say that anybody who was undertaking an assassination campaign against Iran had clearly reached a conclusion that matters were very serious and they were down to desperate measures. That may point to increased danger in the near future.
Michael Eisenstadt, director of the Military and Security Studies program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, says Israel fits that description. He says Israel seeks to slow down Iran's nuclear progress, even if it can't stop it, short of using military force.
I would say that the Israelis probably don't look at covert action to halt Iran's nuclear program. It didn't work with the Iraqi program, and I think their experience with targeted killings, has taught them that targeted killings don't halt terrorism as well. But I think they seek incremental advantage by engaging in covert operations to buy time for sanctions to work, because sanctions by their very nature are slow acting.
Few analysts believe that covert action will deter Iran's leaders from their nuclear ambitions. But Iran has been engaging in its own spy games. Late last year, the United States announced an Iranian plot had been uncovered to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to Washington, but many of the details are murky. Iran has periodically arrested visitors and charged them with espionage, often to use them as bargaining chips. Earlier this month, Amir Hekmati, a former U.S. Marine, was sentenced to death by an Iranian court on espionage charges. His family and the U.S. government have denied the spying allegations. Gary Thomas, VOA News, Washington.
Pakistan's military has formally rejected the findings of a U.S. inquiry into last year's NATO airstrikes that killed 24 Pakistani soldiers along the Afghan border. The Pakistani military disagreed with the U.S. claim that American forces acted in self-defense and with appropriate force after being fired upon by Pakistani troops. Last month, U.S. officials blamed inadequate coordination by both Pakistani and U.S.-led forces for the November 26th attack and said Monday they stood behind the investigation. U.S. State Department spokeswoman Victoria Nuland.
We believe it was done in a thorough manner. I would remind that we did offer to the Pakistani government, to the Pakistani military, that they could participate fully in our investigation and have their own people on our team. They declined to participate. That could have led to more convergence of view, perhaps, but we remain open to continuing to work with the Pakistanis, civilians, military, on the way forward, and we look forward to the completion of their own internal review so that our work can go forward.
Pakistan called the NATO strike unprovoked and said that the fundamental cause of the incident was the failure of the coalition to share its near-border operation with Pakistan at any level. The government responded to the attack by shutting down NATO's two main Pakistani supply routes into Afghanistan and ordering U.S. personnel to evacuate an airbase in Baluchistan province. Christopher Snaden, a South Asia analyst with the Melbourne-based Asia Calling Consultancy, tells VOA's Victor Beattie the NATO attack is only the latest in a series of incidents causing a deep divide in bilateral relations.
There were two major incidents, one of which we're tending to forget, and that was the arrest of the alleged CIA agent, Mr. Davis, I think his name was, in Lahore. That created a furore, and a lot of Pakistanis were upset that he was allowed to get back to the US after apparently paying blood money. And the other one, of course, about which the Pakistanis are terribly embarrassed, was the US movement into Abbottabad and taking out of Osama bin Laden. So this is really just another one of those major incidents that are causing big rifts in the US-Pakistan relationship.
The Pakistan military statement goes on to say the fundamental cause of the 26 November incident was the failure of U.S. ISAF forces over on Afghanistan's side to share its near-border operations with Pakistan at any level. Is the fear that Pakistan will in turn tell the terrorists because of their alleged ties with terror groups?
Yes, I think that's the reason why ISAF is not communicating with Pakistan terribly closely. They do fear that information will be passed on to the people with whom ISAF are trying to negate, I suppose. So that is an ongoing issue. I think also recalling at the time that there were concerns because Momand agencies quite north in the Fatah group of 7 tribal agencies. At the time there were also reports about Afghans filtering into Pakistan and doing things there. And I think the Pakistanis, which may be why this incident occurred, were a little bit on edge at the time. So somewhere in between the two stories possibly lies the truth that maybe the Pakistanis did fire on the Afghans or the ISAF forces or whatever, and in return the ISAF forces fired on them. So it's difficult to get to the truth.
do you see any possibility in the future of closer U.S.-Pakistani military cooperation?
Well, it is a possibility. As things look at the moment, though, there's a long way between the two militaries. I think there's a significant amount of mistrust, and it's going to take a long time for that to be restored.
Well, the United States acknowledged in its report last month that its forces failed to determine who was firing at them and whether they were friendly. The U.S. said its troops used incorrect maps and mistakenly provided Pakistan with the wrong location where they said fighting was taking place, an area of about 14 kilometers apart.
The whole border, that whole old Durand line that separates Afghanistan from Pakistan, is fraught with difficulties because it is a line, and it's not always certain where that particular border is. So that's one of the aspects, I suppose. The other aspect is human error. And American soldiers, even though they're highly skilled and have a lot of high technology, are also human beings, and they may make mistakes as well. And equally, on the other side, they would also make mistakes. So it's problematic.
Snaden says while suspected U.S. unmanned drone strikes targeting militants across the border inside Pakistan are down in number, he says U.S.-Pakistani military cooperation appears to remain strong. Up next is our weekly poll feature, and joining me is our Middle East online editor, Yuri Hiltaichuk, to sum up our last topic and share the results. What do you have for us today, Yuri?
Yes, hi, Susan. The United Nations Security Council is generally regarded as the most authoritative body when it comes to issues of conflict resolution. Over the years, it has been tasked with intervening in a number of crises, but the outcomes have not always been considered fruitful or effective. In the case of the conflict in Syria, for instance, many would have liked to have seen the Security Council approving something more decisive than just verbal condemnation and economic sanctions. Many times any drastic action is toned down by the way the Security Council operates, and often its hands are tied because of some countries' permanent membership and veto power. So in light of this, we were curious to find out whether people would actually support scrapping these two features to try to make the Security Council a more effective or at least a more decisive body. And according to our poll results, an overwhelming 80% of voters thought that some kind of change in the way the Security Council operates is needed. More specifically, 31% of poll participants were in favor of abolishing permanent membership and veto rights, making a majority vote binding instead. 38% of voters thought that only veto rights should be scrapped, and 8% of voters would only abolish permanent membership. Then, on the other side of the spectrum, we had 13% of voters saying that the Security Council is effective as is and requires no changes, and 7% of voters said that they were not sure whether any changes were needed. And these numbers are based on close to 1,100 votes that we received, and as always, I need to point out that this poll is not scientific.
So, what are we going to be asking this coming week?
Well, tomorrow marks the one-year anniversary of the beginning of Egypt's Arab Spring, which led to the ouster of longtime President Hosni Mubarak, the installation of a military council that is supposed to rule the country until a new president is elected, and we also now have a new parliament in place where Islamist parties hold about 70% of all seats. So the question that begs itself for this coming week is Egypt better off today than it was a year ago? And anybody can weigh in by casting their vote on our site, voanews.com/me. Again, that's voanews.com/me. And we'll meet here again in a week with the results.
Well, thank you very much, Yuri, for stopping by.
My pleasure, Susan.
That's VOA Middle East online editor Yuri Hiltaichuk. This has been VOA's Middle East Monitor. Join us Monday through Friday for news from the region and of interest to the region. Coming up on International Edition, victims of domestic violence in one part of Afghanistan are facing a grim choice. Thank you, though, for tuning in to the Voice of America.
For more on the stories you've heard on our radio programs, visit our website at voanews.com. That's where you'll find in-depth reports, related stories, videos, and more from our team of correspondents. Or take the news with you by downloading podcasts of your favorite VOA program. That's at voanews.com. Online news for a changing world.